Welcome to Taiwan Talks on Tour in Japan. I'm Rath Wang. Taiwan President Lai Ching-te just returned from a state visit from the Marshall Islands, Palau and Tuvalu, three of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies in the Pacific. I'm here at Waseda University in the heart of Tokyo to speak with Greg Dvorak, Professor of International Research. Let's hear what he has to say about the future of Taiwan-Pacific Island nation ties and the critical role of Japan. Greg grew up in the Marshall Islands and is an expert in the Pacific Islands history and contemporary culture and how Japan fits into that, and also what is going on in the situation between Taiwan and the Pacific Islands and also its relationship with Japan and superpowers such as the US and China. The president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, his first visit overseas is actually to the Marshall Islands, the first visit since taking office. What do you feel is the significance of the Marshall Islands to Taiwan?
Having an ally in the Pacific and having a whole nation state like the Marshall Islands, which has a seat at the United Nations, having a relationship like that with a country that has that kind of status can help Taiwan leverage its needs and its own desires on the world stage. I mean, we have to admit that. But at the same time, I feel that there's a lot more of a humanitarian decency in the ways that Taiwan engages with the Marshall Islands. And I think for Taiwan as well, the recognition that they have in a place that is so importantly located in the center of the Pacific is actually quite significant. Taiwan also has, there are a lot of fishing agreements and different fishing companies from Taiwan that are working in Marshallese waters and in waters around the Marshall Islands and other parts of Micronesia. And because Taiwan has committed quite a bit to their indigenous First Nations populations, who also share roots with people of the Marshall Islands, there's sort of a deep ancestral tie.
Greg, you focused a great deal of your research on the Marshall Islands, which is one of Taiwan's remaining three diplomatic allies in the Indo-Pacific. What is the state of that relationship?
The Marshall Islands has a very strong relationship with Taiwan. And of course, I cannot speak for the Marshall Islands government, but I do know that they have been renewing their relationship, that for the inauguration of President Lai, President Hilda Heine went to Taiwan to commemorate that. And I think that, significantly, there are some very deep ties between Taiwan and the Marshall Islands that are quite interesting if you look at the history between these places. For example, Taiwan was also colonized by Japan, and so was the Marshall Islands, and was in fact, it was a League of Nations mandated territory, but essentially it was part of a colonized sphere of influence in that region. So although Taiwan and the Marshall Islands may not have had much contact with each other during the colonial period before World War II, they do now have a lot of things in common, having experienced colonialism extensively, having also had to deal with big superpowers around them in different ways.
Taiwan's immediate threat is from China, and Marshall Islands, you said, shares a history with Taiwan. It was only about 10 years difference in terms of when Japan colonized both countries. How do you see the relationship going forward, given that Taiwan deals with this great threat, and there's also uncertainty from the United States with re-election of former President Trump?
The United States has a very long and enduring and very difficult relationship with the Marshall Islands. The United States tested 67 nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958. Which were devastating, which irradiated large parts of the Marshall Islands. The United States has also, though, been a very important post-war ally to the Marshall Islands, has supported their economy extensively. Many Marshallese have migrated to the United States because of favorable immigration policies that enable Marshallese people to move to the US. But I think in the case of China, there's a fear of a general reconfiguration of the Pacific. The post-war world order has been complicated and difficult in many ways, but it has become the status quo for so many people in the Pacific. And especially in Micronesia, in the northern Pacific, where the Marshall Islands is located, and the neighboring countries of the Marshall Islands, that American sort of connection is something that people take for granted. And so to think of that under threat is very intimidating for a lot of people. Now, the other problem is that China has allied with a number of countries throughout the Pacific, offering very large aid packages, building large hospitals, a lot of infrastructure. But at the same time, the way that they have been developed, so to speak, in the post-war period has been in some ways as accessories to the United States. So the United States relies on the Marshall Islands as a strategic place to use in its Pacific sort of security strategy.
With that in mind, wouldn't you think China would actually want to pull that from the United
Precisely.
States?
I think that that's a logical step, and that's what a lot of analysts say, that China is wanting to increase its influence and also achieve some sort of military hegemony within Oceania. And again, creating all sorts of favorable situations for itself in many different countries that actually surround the Marshall Islands, including Kiribati and the Federated States of Micronesia.
So what do you believe is stopping or preventing the Marshall Islands from switching diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China?
The bigger factors here are to retain a free and open democratic sort of fairness and to ensure that there are equal partnerships in the Pacific. Pacific Island countries are wise and very experienced with colonialism. They know how big countries work, and they know how the United States in particular works in terms of working with them closely, but also maybe manipulating them in some ways. And so they fear what China might want to do, but at the same time, I think they tend to prefer those kinds of security arrangements and the solidity of the United States, and also their relationships with Japan and other countries around the Pacific.
So how does Japan come in terms of security with Pacific Island nations, and also to a larger or less clear extent to Taiwan?
I think that Japan is also very anxious about the possibility of Chinese buildup, the possibility of military action. Japan is very conscious of border disputes and territorial disputes, for example, around the Senkaku Islands.
With the recent airspace incursions.
With the recent airspace incursions and so forth. And so I think that is a big factor in Japan's concern and increasing policy proposals to build up military defenses, not only in partnership with the United States, but also through the Japan Self-Defense Forces. So around the borderlands or the waters closest to Taiwan, in Okinawa, for example, Japan is actually building new bases, its own bases. There have been US bases sited within those spaces, but this is actually new stuff to have Japanese missile bases on Ishigaki, for example, or to have something in Miyako-jima or Yonaguni Island. These are all kind of new strategic alliances. And so Japan did not have quite as much interest in the Pacific Islands until relatively recently, but is compelled to renew its ties and build up even more infrastructure support, more scholarships, more aid for fisheries, things like, again, educational initiatives. And I think the biggest thing for Japan is actually to support its this was introduced in this last year during the Palm Summit of 2024, a climate resilience plan, working directly with Pacific Island nations around preserving their climate integrity and making sure that climate change doesn't obliterate their islands. And this is a really big issue. It's climate change is really on the top of the list for so many Pacific islands.
Do you see Taiwan coming in terms of climate change?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that Taiwan has a very robust climate policy and is very committed to mitigating climate change in different ways. I know that they've done quite a lot to improve, for example, solar power generation, also sustainability on small islands. There are various consultants and different people that are working with thinking about climate change mitigation in those places as well. So partnering with Taiwan is a good idea for the Marshall Islands because you have a very high level access to the government. with Taiwan. The president of a nation is coming to the Marshall Islands and intervening and talking with the Marshall Islands president. She herself, Hilda Heine, is a PhD. She's a very educated woman who has a very deep commitment to preserving and protecting the Marshall Islands and fighting against climate change. And she's also been very adamant about her and her country's very deep commitment to their relationship with Taiwan. For the Marshall Islands to be able to partner with a country like Taiwan, which is also standing up to a massive superpower, Taiwan can be a bit of a role model for the Marshall Islands. And I think that in some ways, Marshallese history also teaches people of Taiwan how to navigate these very difficult kinds of relationships.
Thank you very much for your insights, Greg. Let's now hear from Takahashi Kosuke, IHS Jane Defense's Japan correspondent. He talks about why Taiwan is so important to Japan. What is Japan's current strategy when it comes to providing support for Taiwan in the case of any contingency or deterring China from attacking Taiwan?
Many Japanese politicians, especially in LDP, think for Japan, Taiwan problem is not somebody else's problem. That's Japan's problem. The late former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo said, Taiwan contingency is Japan's contingency, right? That's a common consensus. But there is a still obstacle in legal point of view. In the diet, they think legally, if Japan is attacked by China, then Japan can support Taiwan. If China's invasion into the Taiwan doesn't relate it to the Japan cannot support the Taiwan militarily. That's their legal binding. So, but in my view, if China invades the Taiwan, and then Yonaguni Island in Okinawa is just 110 kilometers away from Taiwan, so that area automatically going to be a battlefield. So Japan automatically involved in the battle conflict. So Japan will participate, I think.
How likely would Japan be drawn into military conflict with China if China invades Taiwan?
So if China invades Taiwan, then U.S. have to help the Taiwan, right? And then if U.S. help Taiwan, China gonna attack the U.S. bases in Japan. At that time, Japan automatically can help Taiwan.
Takashi-san, you've also written quite a deal on the USS Washington. What does that mean for the region?
Having a U.S. aircraft is very, very important in this region. China always see power vacuum. If there is a power vacuum in this region, if there is a power vacuum, China may think to invade Taiwan. If U.S. aircraft is going to Middle East or Atlantics, there is a power vacuum in Asia, right? So at that time, China may think, Xi Jinping may think, this is a time to be able to invade Taiwan.
How do you compare the USS Washington to the USS Reagan? Is this an upgrade?
I don't see quite much difference. Both are nuclear-armed, nuclear power-based aircraft, right? Quite big. I used to ride get aboard the U.S. aircraft Independence in Hokkaido. That's almost like an island, big island, and then they can launch lots of the fighter jet.
Still staying in the region, let's talk a bit more about Japan's critical role in maintaining peace and security as well as stability in the Indo-Pacific and what that means for Taiwan. With me here today is Professor Watanabe Tsuneo, Senior Fellow of the Security Studies Program at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Thank you very much for coming on our show today, Professor.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Some say time is limited in terms of what China is thinking in terms of Taiwan, and there's a lot of talk in Japan about a Taiwan contingency. What do you say to this close coordination? Is it in time to prevent and deter China from taking aggressive action?
That's very important. By the way, that's not only for China, but also North Korean missile attack too. And I think so far, Japan and U.S., the alliance coordination mechanism has been working not so bad. But we really needed to the more efficient and speeding up, considering potential contingency. So, no, why the U.S. and Japan didn't agree before? Before somehow the hurdle was hard because of Japanese domestic politics. Japanese domestic, some opposition was really worried about some Japan's entrapment of unnecessary warfare.
Has that changed?
Changed because at that time, somehow the position was somehow relatively safe. And for example, North Korea's missile capability was much smaller, and China's military capability was much smaller. I'm talking about before 20 years ago. But it's time to seriously consider the contingency both.
So the Japanese people are okay with that?
Japanese people are now getting a support for such kind of the grading up Japan's military role. But that's probably the very big change. That's one of the reasons Japan agree with the United States and asking U.S. to the more coordination, closer coordination, and command and control.
And given that there will be a leadership change in Washington come January, Donald Trump during his first term did put pressure on Japan to spend more and also talk about having Japan pay more for U.S. troops and U.S. facilities in Japan. Do you feel that could impede Japan's role in securing the Asia-Pacific?
I think basically Japan really need to increase our own defense budget in order to achieve the several capabilities Japan already promised to not only U.S. but Japan's own people. So big challenge is really for the Prime Minister Ishiba to persuade Japan's diet.
Is there a smart way to pass that and to convince the diet, parliamentarians, and also the people to put that out?
First of all, I think now the Ishiba government doesn't have a majority in lower house. Big trouble. So really need to cooperate with the opposition party. That's one thing. And general public agreed to, for example, when Japan introduced counter-strike capability, that's the purchasing the Tomahawk cruise missile and Japan's own indigenous missile. They agree, people agree. But people don't agree what kind of money. People usually don't like increasing a tax, for example. But Japan's budget is not so good situation, especially worst in OECD country. So really need to the political agreement to what kind of the budget is possible to. And again, the U.S. is pushing a much more budget. Probably.
And that will also influence how Japan will
Right. So that's big challenge. It's possible because people's support for the increasing Japan's defense is clear.
When it comes to the U.S.-Japan alliance, you characterize it as a public good for regional security. And this is why Japan has offered support to the Philippines, and you talked about the importance of maritime security. Do you feel there could be more cooperation with Taiwan in a similar fashion?
Yeah, I think especially, the war happening in the South China Sea is the gray zone challenge by China. I think that challenge has been already in East Asia, China, surrounding Senkaku Island. So that's very important public goods to share with almost all regional players to secure the regional order. And the Taiwan definitely the sharing such the interest. But at the same time, Taiwan is not regarded as the state relation with the partner. So we really need to consider some good way to what kind of the cooperation, especially maritime cooperation between Taiwan and Japan.
You talked about one of the silver linings with second Trump term, aside from uncertainty that many of U.S. allies feel, is that it actually brings U.S. allies closer together because there might be less commitment from the U.S. to protect allies in the Pacific. Do you feel this will have an impact on Taiwan and the Philippines?
Yeah. I think if next president, Mr. Trump, are not seriously interested in security in Taiwan and East Asia, that's going to be very bad message to China. My sense is that Mr. Trump is really interested in securing U.S. supremacy position. So he is really tried to defeat China in economic terms. But unfortunately, he didn't have any experience in the security area. So he's not aware of security and the economy is so interrelated too. For example, the securing regional stability is a guarantee for the smooth trade and good investment. But anyway, that's the reason that Trump really needed a good surrounding, I think, in administration. And one good news is National Security Advisor, the appointment for the President Trump is Michael Waltz is somehow very the rational and the pragmatic, I would say, realist. Same thing applies for the Senator Marco Rubio, who's going to be the next the Secretary of State, also appointed by Mr. Trump.
And a long-time supporter of Taiwan.
Very strong supporter to Taiwan, as well as the sharing the very serious concern of China's challenge, right? So that's very, very good news.
So how worried do you feel Taiwan and the Philippines should be with allies in the cabinet, but with some uncertainty from President Trump?
Especially the Taiwan has a very good advantage. That's your connection with Republican Party, Congress. I think especially the Senate, Republican, still has a lot of the traditional realist compared to the House.
But how would that balance with the executive branch, which Trump is in control of?
Again, in the executive branch, most influential player to the Mr. Trump is a National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. At least two of them was somehow very much interested in and knowledgeable to the Taiwan and the regional security. Really good, strong one. Of course, we cannot expect too much because Trump himself is really showing a little bit more we call the restrainer. That's U.S. should not invest too much for their power to the securing other countries.
You've also mentioned that Donald Trump and his team is more hawkish and very cautious about China, including Trump himself. How do you feel that Japan and also Taiwan and other allies in the region should find the right angle?
Tricky one is depends on who in U.S. Trump administration. Some people are very anti-China in economic sense, trade sense. Some are more security sense. And my sense is more security sense guys in the Trump administration. That's good news. But not so good news is that Trump didn't join such kind of interest too. So I think interaction within the Trump administration would determine what kind of a policy eventually the Trump administration would take. And not so bad. Generally, they are anti-China. They don't want China to be the hegemon in the region. That's good news. Bad news is that some people are more economic interest rather than security interest.
In terms of good news and in terms of the Trump administration, we've seen the Prime Minister of Japan, Ishiba-san sent Nagashima-san to Washington, D.C., and he spent a few days with future nominees that will be in the Trump second administration. Do you feel that is part of this whole trying to find the right balance?
Okay. Aki Nagashima, he's the Japan's member of House of Representatives of Liberal Democratic Party, and he is regarded as a very close friend of Taiwan too. And Mr. Nagashima spent his the graduate work, and also he worked in a think tank, Council on Foreign Relations. So he's regarded as one of the leading security experts of Japan. So, and he already experienced the senior defense minister already. So he's really relied by the American people and Taiwanese people and the Japanese people too. So, and now he is an advisor to Prime Minister Ishiba, and this time he visited Washington, D.C. to make some groundwork. Groundwork means that Trump administration is not yet fixed. So need to talk to many people who could be in Trump administration.
So with that groundwork, do you feel Taiwan was part of that? The message included Taiwan, such as...
Groundwork is interpersonal relations. His policy is already clear. Everybody knows what Turkey would say. He's a strong defender of Taiwan, a strong defender of a U.S.-Japan alliance. So, but making some network connection is always important too. Aki Nagashima has a lot of already network in Washington, D.C., but warming up, and now I'm in charge for the advisor to Mr. Ishiba. So let's keep in touch and let's share some information. So his work gonna start next January, but groundwork already done.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to talk.